Hopefully that's everybody in now. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Dr. Alison Sheridan for giving up her time this afternoon to talk to us about making sense of Scotland's Neolithic funerary monuments and funerary practices. This is a really interesting topic, and it also ties in with European Heritage Festival's theme of architecture and heritage this year. So EHD is also something which we are part of. And again, I'll put links to that in the chat. So hopefully, I'm sure all of you know who Alison is, but if you don't, I'll just give you a little flavour of who she is and her background. So as well as being our vice chair, which we're very pleased about, Alison is a specialist in Neolithic, Paleolithic and Bronze Age archaeology Bronze Age of Britain and Ireland. She's worked for the National Museums of Scotland and its predecessor organisation from 1987 until 2019. And she was latterly the principal curator of early prehistory in the Department of Scottish History and Archaeology. She's now a freelance archaeological consultant, and her research has focused on Scotland's early farmers, and she is an authority on stone axe heads, early prehistoric pottery, and jewellery of jet and jet-like materials. She was president of the Prehistoric Society from 2010 to 2014, and in 2020 she delivered the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland's Round Lecture series on Neolithic Scotland. So I think we can all say that Alison knows what she's talking about in this field. So I will pass over to her now for you to enjoy. Okay, many thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very, very much, Tessa. And welcome everybody to this wonderful celebration of European archaeology. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to see so many of you, some well-kent faces. Hi, everybody. And on behalf of Archaeology Scotland, the wonderful charity that's dedicated to making archaeology accessible for all, I'm going to take you on a deep dive into the fascinating story of Scotland's funerary monuments and funerary practices during the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age. Funerary monuments such as this magnificent, world-famous, and indeed UNESCO World Heritage passage tomb at Maes Howe in Orkney feature prominently among the visible remains of the people who inhabited Scotland between around 4000 BC and around 2500 BC. And there have been myriad perspectives on and approaches to understanding these monuments, including the fascinating recent research by master's student Jay van der Reyden of the University of Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute in Orkney that claims that Maes Howe, as a house for the dead, has design details that are an inversion of their arrangement in the houses for the living. Jay's work grabbed the attention of the world's press, and rightly so, since it makes us think about just how people in Neolithic Scotland conceptualised death and the world of the ancestors and gods. But as ever, the world's press and webosphere can be guaranteed to run with a good story and take it in directions where perhaps things are taken a tad too literally. I love the idea of Maes Howe being a functioning portal into the other world. And I don't know about you, but I can't wait till I go and experience that for myself. You'd certainly get good value for your £11 entrance ticket. By way of an introduction to our topic, I propose to offer a summary of the various perspectives on and approaches to Scottish Neolithic funerary monuments and funerary practices, accompanied by a selection of examples. I shall then present the information on what kinds of funerary monument were constructed and used where in Scotland, and what non-monumental funerary practices were being used around the same time, dealing with this evidence in four time slices, starting with the period between around 4000 and around 3750 BC, which witnessed the first appearance of any kind of Neolithic funerary practice. I'll then go on to describe developments between around 3750 BC and around 3600, 3500 BC, exploring the different regional trajectories that we can see. I'll do the same for the period between 3635 and 3000 BC, and finally, the same for the first half of the third millennium BC. So, without more ado, let's briefly review the various perspectives and approaches. First up, there are those approaches that are concerned with recording, description, classification, and typochronological ordering of these monuments. We are all greatly indebted to the late, great Audrey Henschel for her enormous achievement in documenting Scotland's megalithic monuments. Her work laid the foundations for all subsequent studies of these monuments, and she was a very worthy recipient of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland's Dorothy Marshall Medal in 2016, then aged 89, having already been honoured by Her Majesty the Queen with an OBE. The medal is for outstanding archaeological work on a voluntary basis. Audrey undertook all of this painstaking fieldwork in her own time, during her holidays from work as a curator at the then named National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. What a gal! Audrey's work touched upon Scotland's non-megalithic monuments, but the person who took this further was the late Ian Kinnis, an assistant keeper at the British Museum, whose two works on long and round barrows you can see here, along with the article that he wrote for the Festschrift, which I and Neil Sharples produced for Audrey back in 1992. Ian's work is particularly valuable in documenting the various phases of construction and modification of non-megalithic monuments, as you can see here in this diagram for the Daladies Long Barrow in Aberdeenshire. Recording techniques have come on in leaps and bounds since the time of Audrey's surveys, and now we have a variety of whizzy techniques, including this 3D photogrammetric modelling that allows people to move around virtually inside a monument and to see it from all kinds of angle. You can even turn these models upside down, but they won't turn into houses if you do that, sadly. Here's one of these models for the chamber tomb at Unston in Orkney. And below you can see the Sketchfab URL for the model that you see here. And if you click on that, you can do a staged walkthrough of this monument yourself. This was made by Dr. Hugo Anderson Weimark, who is one of the people who took over from me at National Museum of Scotland. Laser scanning is another of these whizzy techniques, and it's been used to great effect during the surveys of chamber tombs in Arran and elsewhere in southwest Scotland that have been undertaken by AOC Archaeology on behalf of Forestry and Land Scotland, and I'm grateful to Matt Ritchie for these images. Laser scans can be very useful for exploring and visualizing stages in the construction of multi-phase monuments, as you can see here with that same Clyde Cairn, the Giant's Graves North, on the Isle of Arran. This shows one version of the sequence of construction that posits 3 successive phases. So the little green thing you can see here is phase 1. Then they added this small tomb, phase 2. Then they created a Clyde Cairn, phase 3. I'll be telling you later what a Clyde Cairn is. A further approach that has examined the architecture of megalithic chamber tombs, that is, the engineering aspects of creating a large structure containing a hollow chamber, is that taken by John Barber, who is also the founder of AOC Archaeology, who has undertaken the experimental construction of part of a chamber tomb based on one of the passage tombs excavated by Alexander Rind at Warehouse in Caithness. Importantly, John also tested this model to destruction by simulating what happens when chambers collapse. And this was a really useful method to show, firstly, how easy it is to mistake patterns of collapsed stone for the deliberate blocking of a tomb, and secondly, in showing what also happened to the bones and the artifacts inside the chamber and how they shifted around upon impact. Although I hasten to add that no dead people were involved in this experiment, thank heavens. Another approach has been to consider the often dramatic landscape setting, the distribution and the orientation of funerary monuments, to investigate aspects such as their prominence against the skyline, their intervisibility, their relationship with settlements, and with landscape features such as mountains, and also any archaeoastronomical orientation they may have. This approach has characterised much of Vicky Cummings' work, for example. And these fine photographs underline just how striking these monuments are in the landscape. And which of us oldies can ever forget Professor Colin Renfrew's spatial analysis of chamber tombs on the Orcadian island of Rousay way back in 1973, where he used Thyssen polygons to sketch out notional territories of the builders and users of these monuments. That's an approach which actually hasn't really stood the test of time. Seeking parallels between funerary monuments as houses for the dead and the contemporary houses for the living harks back to the research of J. van der Heyden that you heard about earlier. And here you can see examples of structural homology that were claimed by Ian Hodder back in the early 80s. My own review of the Scottish evidence that was published in a volume dedicated to the topic of funerary monuments as houses for the dead, concluded that instances of an unequivocal read across in the interior design between houses and funerary monuments are actually not all that common. What seems more important than literal translation is that monuments were metaphorical houses for the dead, as you can see here, where you can see parallels. Professor Colin Richards in Orkney has run much further with the idea of metaphor in funerary monuments by regarding tombs as permeable and animate wrappers for the dead, where a reciprocal flow of substances and essences took place between the decomposing bodies and the fabric of the monument, with these fluid transactions being necessary for the reproduction of society. That's an interesting idea, albeit one that's hard to prove, although few could disagree about the numinous and otherworldly quality of these special places. Moving on, some have sought to understand Scotland's Neolithic funerary monuments by considering the phenomenon of megalithism, its origin and its spread on an international scale. The work of Bettina Schultz-Paulsen, focusing on radiocarbon dates, is the latest example of this, with her map showing proposed routes of its spread. As with a lot of big picture narratives, however, one finds that the devil is in the detail. And, as ever, it's horribly easy for the press to get completely the wrong end of the stick. Note the fine photograph of a megalith in southern Sweden under the Stonehenge headline, and I can say Stonehenge was not inspired by the prehistoric French. As for studies that focus on the human remains from Scottish Neolithic monuments and other contexts, there's an awful lot that we can now find out about diet, illnesses, appearance and demography from human remains by undertaking osteological, DNA and isotopic and other analyses. Research by Dr. Dave Lawrence on the human remains from Isbister Chamber Tomb on Orkney, for example, has shown that there is a marked incidence of skull abnormalities and evidence for interpersonal violence against men, women, and children. Here, for example, you can see an elderly person from Isbister, possibly a woman, whose eyes are misaligned and who had been dispatched by a blow to the head from a blunt object such as a mace head. And indeed, there are other skulls from Neolithic Orkney at Cuin where you're able to match the hole in the top of the head with the mace heads that they were using at the time. And here you see another candidate for blunt force trauma from a recently excavated chamber tomb at Strathglebe on Skye, and I'm grateful to Angela Boyle for this image. I've just mentioned ancient DNA research, and interestingly, a recent study has found that there is a relatively high degree of inbreeding in Neolithic Orkney, which may perhaps account for the large amount of sort of unusual cranial shape, and also perhaps for the interpersonal violence that we've just seen. That's something we could discuss if you like. What DNA studies have been able to confirm is that the first farmers in Scotland, just as elsewhere in Britain and Ireland, had been incomers from the continent, most probably from various points around the north and northwest coast of France. One study by Sanchez Quinto and colleagues has picked up on an apparent genetic affinity between Neolithic farmers in Scotland and Scandinavia. This has played into a narrative, partly encouraged by Schultz-Paulsen's work, that there were connections between Scotland and Scandinavia during the Neolithic. And Sanchez Quinto et al. Try to argue that passage tomb construction spread to Scandinavia from Britain and Ireland through migration. But archaeologically, this is wholly implausible, not least because the tombs that they are comparing are separated by at least 600 years. We'll be coming back to other claims for British Scandinavian links in a moment. Something else I need to mention about human remains research is that both Dave Lawrence's Isbister work and that by Rebecca Crozier on the large assemblage from Quantones Passage Tomb, also in Orkney, has highlighted the taphonomy of the remains, revealing evidence for certain acts of manipulation, such as this drilling of holes through some bones from Quantones. Experimental work by Rebecca has concluded that these holes are indeed ancient. Their careful studies have also shown that many of the conclusions previously reached by Judson Chesterman, who published several highly influential osteological reports in the 1970s, are incorrect. The minimum number of individuals represented at Quantones, for example, has been revised down from Chesterman's enormous original estimate of 157 down to 59. And that for Isbister from an enormous 342 down to 85. Similarly, many of the pathologies identified by Dave Lawrence had been dismissed or overlooked by Chesterman as natural features, and Chesterman's hypothesis that bodies had been excarnated, that is, allowed to rot to their skeletal form before being deposited in chamber tombs, has been roundly disproved. People entered chamber tombs as cadavers, and once they had decayed to skeletal form, their bones were moved around in the tomb to mingle with those of others. Rebecca Crozier has been able to show that some indeed were deliberately crushed as part of this process of losing their individual identity and becoming part of the generalized ancestors. The last thing I want to say about human remains is that Rick Schulting's current research on isotope values in Scottish Neolithic human remains has revealed, intriguingly, that there seem to be pattern differences in the carbon and nitrogen isotope data for people buried in different ways in different parts of Scotland. Here, for example, you can see the results for individuals buried in Clyde Cairns in southwest Scotland, the green squares, versus those for individuals buried in Orkney Cromarty-type passage tombs on the northern mainland of Scotland, the orange squares, and for those individuals buried in caves and in rock shelter and on shell midden in the west of Scotland, the peach-coloured circles. Does this mean that these three cohorts of people had different diets? Or is there an underlying environmental reason behind this that's influencing the geochemical signatures in different areas? Work on that particular question continues. Moreover, studies of the animal bones found in chamber tombs have thrown up some really interesting results. It had long been suggested by John Hedges and others that the presence of numerous bones from specific animals in individual Orcadian chamber tombs might indicate some kind of totemic use for these animals. We're now able to add that these are all secondary deposits, placed in the monuments several centuries after they were originally built and first used. So our old friend from Cueen here was one of 24 dogs whose remains were found in the chamber. Only a few bones now survive, but 4 have produced radiocarbon dates around the middle of the 3rd millennium, at least 500 years later than the expected date of the tomb's construction. Likewise, at Isbister, the so-called Tomb of the Eagles, I and Finbar McCormick of Queen's University Belfast got dates for 2 of these eagles, and they fall resolutely within the second half of the 3rd millennium. And this is after the dates have been corrected for a marine offset. So we'll have to rename this as the Tomb of the Secondary Eagle Deposits. Not quite so snappy, but never mind. Finally, at the Now of Yarso, again on Orkney, 2 of the 36 red deer found in this chamber tomb have recently produced dates for a project by Historic Environment Scotland within the last 2 centuries of the 3rd millennium BC. The last approach to funerary monuments and practices I want to mention here concerns the artifacts found in them, and the ones in Orkney have recently been the subject of a major AHRC project, the Grave Goods Project, led by Duncan Garrow, Mel Giles and Neil Wilkin. This explored whether such objects were indeed grave goods for the dead, and if so, were they intended as communal gifts in these communal monuments or as individual offerings, or whether pots such as this had been used in funeral feasting or both. So that gives you an idea of the range of approaches and perspectives that have been brought to bear on Scottish funerary monuments. My own approach. Oh, I'm trying to move this on and it's not moving on. That's interesting. Here we are, thank heavens. My own approach in trying to make sense of this cornucopia of evidence is to examine not only funerary monuments, but rather all evidence relating to how people in Neolithic Scotland dealt with the dead, how they conceptualized death and the world of the dead, and how they related to the dead. In doing so, it's vital to get a grip on chronology, especially since it's abundantly clear that monument construction wasn't a universal or a continuous feature over the 1500 years under our purview. To give you a tiny snapshot, here's a summary view of the where and when of monument construction. The red areas relate to monuments in the Breton, Atlantic tradition and its successors, and the yellow areas relate to monuments in the Carinated Bowl Neolithic tradition we'll be coming on to in a minute. Let's now look at the evidence for the earliest funerary practices in Neolithic Scotland prior to around 3750 BC. And here you can see the different strands of Neolithization that you have. So there are at least 4 different strands of people coming from different parts of northern and northwest France. So it's the one at the top right and the one at the bottom left, which are most relevant to Scotland. And we're going to be dealing with the one at the top right, where people came from the Morbihan, you can see in the southeast Brittany, in skin boats up the Atlantic facade, arriving around 4000 BC. And they stopped in Wales, they stopped on the west coast of Scotland, they stopped around the north coast of Ireland, arriving probably around 4000 BC. And here you have the magnificent monument at Achnacribeg on the west coast of Scotland, north of Oban, excavated by the late great Graham Ritchie. It's a 2-phase monument, with the first phase consisting of a closed polygonal chamber with a massive capstone that was surrounded by a low stone cairn, circular cairn, and this is ringed in red here. The second phase, shown here with surrounded by a green circle, involved adding a simple passage tomb and extending the cairn to make it pear-shaped. Both the monument type and the pottery found inside the passage tomb are absolutely typical for what was being built and used in the Morbihan region of southeast Brittany, between around 4300 and 3900 BC. And here at the bottom right, you can see another example of the distinctive Breton late Castellic pottery with its rainbow motif that was found in a simple passage tomb of the same date range at Virville in Normandy. Now, it's interesting, this rainbow motif in Achnacribeg and in the monuments in Brittany, they found a piece of rock crystal, which if you hold it up to the light, diffracts the light and you see the colours of the rainbow. So perhaps it was believed that the rainbow was the link between this world and the world of the ancestors and the gods. Fantastic stuff. I love it. And here you can see some of the Breton comparanda for the closed chambers and the simple passage tombs, and also for late Castellic pottery. You can just see the rainbow motif on these bowls from Ercra. Also shown here on the right is the dating evidence for the late Castellic period in Brittany, and this is what enables us to say that Achnacribeg and its companion monuments were built at some time between 43 and 39, probably around 4000. Sadly, there are no radiocarbon dates for the construction and the initial use for Achnacribeg itself. But there are pointers towards it probably dating to the 40th century BC. Here you see the closed chamber at Molly, just 11 kilometres from Achnacribeg, which shows that these monuments were still in use during the 38th or 37th century BC. I'm really glad that I got this date for the cremated human bone from this site as part of my National Museum Scotland Dating Cremated project, Dating Cremated Bones project, way back in 2003, although at the time I hadn't grasped its significance, but I do now, though. And here you see the ceramic family tree for Castilic pottery in Brittany and Scotland, and for its descendants, as it were, in southwest Scotland and northeast Ireland. From this, you can clearly see that the Achnacarry Beg pot aligns very firmly with pottery that's been dated to between 43 and 39 in northwest France. As for the overall distribution of these closed polygonal chambers in Britain and Ireland and simple passage tombs, you can see that it is markedly coastal, and this is consistent with the idea of a diasporic immigration of early farmers from the Morbihan. These farmers clearly succeeded in establishing themselves and flourishing in Western Scotland and Ireland, where these closed chambers and simple passage tombs stand at the beginning of the long and complex development trajectories of passage tombs in these two areas, whereas in Wales, this strand of Neolithization seems to have died out. There probably wasn't a critical mass of people. And let's remind ourselves that just a day or so's sail from Achnacarry, on the island of Oronsay, between around 4,300 and 3,700 BC, indigenous hunter-fisher foragers, contemporary with our early French farmers, were disposing of their dead in a wholly different way, by laying them out, probably on platforms, on their rubbish heaps, their shell middens, so that they could, I mean, this, you wouldn't, nowadays, you wouldn't throw Granny out with the rubbish, would you? I hope. But the idea there was that since everything came from Mother Nature, by putting the dead back, by giving them back to Mother Nature, so that the animals and the birds could eat the bodies and return them to Mother Nature, they are really honouring Mother Nature, who gave them all that they had. Before leaving the west of Scotland, it's important to note that burial in megalithic monuments was not the only way that continental immigrant farmers disposed of their dead. In caves and on a shell midden in and around Oban, and in a rock shelter at Ancoran on Skye, and in one of the Cowsay caves in Murray, people chose to deposit their dead in these locations, with Rascolly Cave in Oban containing a large number of individuals buried communally. DNA analysis of their remains clearly indicates that these were incomers or descendants of incomers from the continent. And in a few cases, we know that there had been intermixing with the local hunter-fisher forager population. We also know that two men buried in MacArthur Cave, that you see in this photo top right, were probably brothers. And there's also a case of first-degree relatedness at the shell midden at Cardingmill Bay. Moreover, we've already noted that the carbon and nitrogen isotope readings differ from those people who were buried in the Clyde cairns in southwest Scotland from the late 38th century BC, and from people who were buried in passage tombs in northeast Scotland from around the 37th century BC. Quite why this is so remains to be seen. All that we can say is that there is no evidence whatsoever from any of these data that these people had consumed seafood, or at least had consumed it in enough quantity for it to show up on their bones. And here is a summary for all the radiocarbon dates we have for people buried in caves, rock shelters, and the shell midden in the west of Scotland. As you can see, the practice of cave burial continued over much of the 4th millennium. We just don't know whether or how these people relate to those who were buried in the Achnacarry Beg type monuments. There aren't caves in Brittany, and with the exception of the person buried in one of the Cowsay caves in northeast Scotland, these people are a very long way away from where carinated bowl Neolithic people were living. So we can't say for sure whether these people came up from Brittany, the ones in the caves, or from the north of France. They certainly came from somewhere on the continent. All that we can say is that, unlike elsewhere in Britain and Ireland, there had not been any indigenous tradition of burying the dead in caves or rock shelters. So this does represent a new way of dealing with the dead. So clearly we've got some way to go before we can bottom out who these early Neolithic people in caves were. They weren't cavemen. Let's move on rapidly to consider the earliest funerary monuments that are associated with the carinated bowl strand of the Neolithic, which featured the arrival in some numbers of farmers from the Nord-Pas-de-Calais region of northern France. Theirs was a non-megalithic funerary tradition that featured laying out bodies, or else disarticulated bones, in these rectangular timber mortuary structures. Artists' reconstructions vary, but it's most likely that the end posts, which are made of a split tree trunk, rose up above the structures as shown on the right. Yeah. It would require a considerable amount of effort to build one of these things. Splitting an oak trunk is no mean feat. Some of these structures had a concave timber facade at one end, and in some cases the structures were enclosed within long trapezoidal or rectangular ditched or timber enclosures, as here at the Ladies in Aberdeenshire, where the enclosure was 60 metres long by 24 metres wide. After a while, these mortuary structures were burnt down, with the human remains in them, burnt down containing the remains. And alternatively, we also know that people would be cremated on open air pyres, and then their remains would be covered by a long or round mound made of earth or stone. At Ewford, here in East Lothian, they built and burnt not one but two of these mortuary structures before they erected the rectangular or trapezoidal barrow. At Slough Cairn in southwest Scotland, they covered the mortuary structure with a trapezoidal stone cairn. And at Pitnacree, near Perth, they covered it with a round mound. Building the barrow over the burnt-down mortuary structure effectively sealed the human remains inside and made it impossible for any additional people to be buried there unless the mound was to be disturbed. And therefore, these mounds monumentalized the small number of people who were buried inside. They certainly weren't used to bury whole communities. Who were these people? They could theoretically have been selected from among the first settlers in an area. In Scotland, unlike in southern England, there's no time gap between the appearance of farming and the appearance of long mounds. By monumentalizing these people, the other members of the community may have designated them as the founding ancestors, the founding fathers, founding mothers, and may have used these monuments to justify their claims to own the land, saying, "This is our land because our ancestors are buried here." These metaphorical houses of the dead would have taken the place in the landscape of the massive early Neolithic communal houses of the earliest farmers that we've seen. Even though the mounds were not a faithful replication of the shape of those halls. Indeed, there's been a lot of debate about whether the shape of British long barrows more generally was referencing a far more ancient form of a longhouse belonging to the 5th millennium linear band ceramic culture on the continent, and I don't want to go into that here. You can read what Alistair Whittle has written about this in this book that you see here. Suffice it to note that these long mounds would have been a very prominent feature of the early Neolithic landscape, and they would have required the communal effort of a large number of people to construct. Their erection would have served to consolidate and be a material expression of the social ties between farming communities within an area. And here you can see the distribution of these non-megalithic long barrows and cairns in Scotland on the left, they're marked by the triangles, and of the distribution of non-megalithic round barrows on the right. These all fall within the parts of Scotland where carinated bowl pottery and indeed large timber halls have been found. Round mounds continue to be constructed into the second quarter of the fourth millennium. One other type of monument that is likely to belong to this early funerary tradition is the long rectangular timber enclosure, as you see here at Douglas Muir and Inch Toothill. Even though no human remains have been found in these, their similarity in shape and size and shape to some of the enclosures built around mortuary structures means that they may have been used for the laying out of corpses to allow them to decompose naturally in the open air. One regional development in southwest Scotland that was underway by 3750 BC was the translation into stone of elements of this non-megalithic tradition. You can see this process in action here at Loch Hill, where in southwest Scotland, where a burnt down timber mortuary chamber and facade was covered over by a trapezoidal cairn and given a new stone facade plus a kind of antechamber. And at Cairnholy 1, again in southwest Scotland, the chamber and the facade represent a stone version of a timber mortuary chamber, complete with its high-end stones, and a stone version of a timber facade. We can tell that this monument is likely to date to around 3800 BC or 3750 because it had produced a fragment of a broken and burnt jadeite axe head, along with sherds from an early style of carinated bowl pottery. Moreover, a piece of unburnt human bone from this monument that's likely to relate to secondary activity has recently produced the radiocarbon date that you can see here. And this bone may be associated with the deposition of a pot with developed carinated bowl type. Cairnholy represents the beginnings of the Clyde cairn tradition of southwest Scotland. A variant on this theme of translating timber structures into stone that's also seen in southwest Scotland, particularly in Galloway, is the construction of simple rectangular stone chambers set within small round cairns. You can see a selection of these, including the pair from Mid Glenarn 1 on the left. These ones were all subsequently incorporated within long mounds, converting them into Clyde cairns. And on the right here, you see the same process at Blast Hill on the Kintyre Peninsula in the far southwest of Scotland. And this site was excavated in 2009 by Vicky Cummings and Gary Robinson. Radiocarbon dates from that site suggest that the earliest phase of the monument belongs to the first quarter of the 4th millennium. Before leaving the topic of these early Neolithic funerary monuments, the question of their forerunners and other comparanda on the continent needs to be touched on briefly. There was indeed a tradition of building long mounds in northern France and Belgium, although no example dating to later than 4200 BC has yet been found. And so far, no parallel for the rectangular mortuary chambers has been found across the channel in those areas. Although it has to be said that far fewer non-megalithic long mounds have been excavated in France and Belgium than in Britain, and many of those mounds were very badly knocked about in World War I and World War II. We simply do not know whether the tradition of building long mounds continued on the continent after 4200 BC, and more excavation is needed. Meanwhile, we can note that there is a superficial similarity between non-megalithic long barrows in Britain and roughly contemporary examples in southern Scandinavia and North Germany. This similarly includes the presence of timber mortuary chambers inside them. While some people have chosen to interpret this similarity as evidence for direct contact across the North Sea, in my opinion, it's much more likely that the relationship was a cousinly one, with both originating in a North French funerary tradition around here. If that is the case, then the presence of timbery mortuary structures in Northern Europe implies that examples of those structures will eventually turn up in long barrows in northern France or Belgium. So much for the monumental aspects of carinated bowl Neolithic funerary practices. It's clear that the non-megalithic mounds only accommodated very small numbers of people, just 3 at Pitnacree, for example. So what happened to all the other bodies of the members of those farming communities? One clue has recently been provided by a pit at Duns in the Scottish borders, where the cremated remains of 4 people, 3 adults and a child, were found along with sherds of carinated bowl pottery in a pit in a settlement. This was found during a watching brief for a wind farm, and it wasn't possible to excavate a wider area to see whether this was part of a settlement, although it probably was. And as far as I know, there's only one other non-monumental site in Scotland where the human remains have been associated with carinated bowl pottery, and that's the settlement at Maybole in South Ayrshire, where scraps of cremated bone were found in 3 pits. Let's now move on to subsequent developments and look at the period between 3750 BC and the middle of the 4th millennium. To summarize, we can see an expansion and development of the Atlantic passage tomb tradition from the west of Scotland that accompanied the secondary expansion of farming in Scotland. We can see a continuing use of caves and rock shelters for burial in Western Scotland. And within the carinated bowl tradition, we can see two developments. The emergence of the regional style of megalithic monument known as the Clyde Cairns in southwest Scotland, and the emergence of massively elongated versions of long mounds and of rectangular mortuary enclosures in parts of eastern and southern Scotland. There's nothing that I can add about cave burial, but I'll whiz you through these other developments quickly. And let's start with that expansion in the Atlantic passage tomb tradition. From its starting point with the early closed chambers and simple passage tombs that we saw at Achnacribeg and Molee, and here's the map of the distribution of these kinds of monument, we can see the expansion in the use of passage tombs out from the west of Scotland to the Hebrides, to the northern mainland of Scotland, and to Shetland, as you can see on this map. We can't say for sure whether it had also spread to Orkney by 3500 BC, but that is a distinct possibility. This expansion is a proxy for the secondary spread of farming communities to new areas. And as you can see from this map, passage tomb use also spread into parts of mainland Scotland that were already occupied by the users of carinated bowl pottery in Aberdeenshire and in the eastern part of Highland region. At the top of this diagram, you can see three examples of small, simple passage tombs whose design isn't all that different from that of Achnacribeg. Two of these are on the northern mainland, with one in the old county of Caithness and the other in Sutherland, while the third is way up in Shetland. The other plans that you see show some of the regional variants of passage tomb that emerged during this period. So there's the Hebridean variant with its distinctive funnel-shaped facade, and on the northern mainland there are the earliest versions of what went on to become the Orkney-Cromarty regional group of passage tombs. You can see in the radiocarbon date diagram that those North Mainland tombs were in use by the 38th century BC. And we can even see the evolution of passage tomb design on the West Mainland, with this monument at Achnacribeg, just 350 metres away from Achnacribeg, represented a vastly aggrandized version. And we can tell from the pottery found inside this that it was in use around 3600 BC. Moving on to developments within the carinated bowl funerary tradition, in southwest Scotland we see the emergence of the Clyde Cairn tradition from its roots in the non-megalithic architecture of mortuary structures and long mounds, and with Cairn Holy One being an intermediate form along the way. There are now an increasing number of radiocarbon dates available for these monuments. And from this date diagram, Rick Schulting has estimated that fully fledged Clyde cairns started to be built sometime between 3765 BC and 3645 BC. The links between Clyde cairns and their congeners in the Isle of Man and in Ireland, where they're called court tombs, are very strong, as you can see. And you can even see it in the use of imported artifacts made of high-quality Antrim flint, such as these arrowheads from Giant's Graves North on Arran. And Rick Schulting's model date for the emergence of Irish court tombs is virtually identical to that for Clyde cairns, as you can see here. The last thing I want to say with regard to Clyde cairns is to remind us that they also appear in hybrid. Oops, I've missed a slide. Okay, and you can find out more about Clyde cairns and their connections with Northeast Ireland in this fantastic book that is available for free called The Bare Bones, and it was by Matt Ritchie, the wonderful Matt Ritchie, who is Forestry Land Scotland's archaeologist. I'm going to take a little bit of water. Good. We should remind ourselves that Clyde cairns also appear in hybridized form in the Outer Hebrides, as here at Cletreval or North Uist. This reflects an architectural fusion between the two formerly discrete traditions of early Neolithic funerary monument, the Atlantic passage tomb tradition and the carinated, where you see in the chamber, and the carinated bowl tradition that you see in the facade and the trapezoidal mound. It was bashed into in the Iron Age, and they put an Iron Age roundhouse there. So it also reminds us of how cultural identities can be reflected in the monuments that people constructed. The other big development within the carinated bowl tradition during the second quarter of the fourth millennium seems to have been the emergence of gigantic versions of earlier Neolithic monument forms in eastern and southern Scotland. So here you can see what looked to be giant versions of the long mounds that we talked about a while ago. They're called bank barrows, and the one at Auchinleck is 342 metres long. The one at Cleven Dyke is a massive 2 kilometres. If you're driving up there, you drive through it. While here you see an example of a cursus monument, 600 metres long. The map here on the right shows the distribution of both of these monument types. And to these we'll have to add there's one cursus that's recently been found on Macri Moor on Arran. And you can note the extreme length of these monuments. Gordon Berkeley's excavations at the Cleven Dyke and investigations at Auchinleck didn't reveal any human remains, and in a way it's neither here nor there as to whether any people had been buried in these barrows. It seems that, as Professor Richard Bradley has argued in the past, the main point of bank barrows was to bring large numbers of people together to construct a communal monument to honour the dead. This project served to cement and perpetuate social ties and a sense of communal identity at the level of many communities, indeed at a tribal level, if you want to use such a term. Hundreds and hundreds of people. Participating in these enormous communal enterprises would be a good way to defuse any tensions between groups of farmers. Cursus monuments may have performed the same function of bringing many people together to create a monument that may ostensibly have been about honouring the dead. Some of them were constructed by felling hundreds of oak trees, and after the participants had erected them and processed up and down these long timber enclosures, a key part of the ritual was to set fire to them. This amazing theatricality of the ritual here. And once again, this will have served to deepen a sense of communal identity. If you're keen to find out more about these monuments, I can highly recommend these books here that you see on the right by Gordon Berkeley and Kenny Brophy, and also the report on the Cursus monuments near Dumfries by Julian Thomas, whose front cover you see here. With its image of a burning cursus. Meanwhile, as for how people in these parts of Scotland actually disposed of the dead at the time, we honestly don't know. They could have left them out inside cursus monuments or used some other practice that has left no trace. We're now going to consider developments between around 3600, 3500 and 3000 BC. During this half millennium or so, virtually all of the monument building activity seems to have gone on in Orkney and the northern mainland of Scotland, with the exception of a recently excavated small chamber tomb at Strathglebe on Skye, and perhaps also a monument at Glecknamay on Bute. But there's evidence for a variety of non-monumental funerary practices in various parts of Scotland at this time, including the continued use of caves for burial. So let's start with the 250 or so monuments of diverse design that were built or modified in Orkney and the northern mainland. And here I realise that I'm treading on eggshells since so much has been written and so many different views have been expressed about these monuments in the past. What we can say is that while there was clearly some sharing of design features between the northern mainland and Orkney, in other words, people on either side of the Pentland Firth were clearly interacting with each other over the centuries. Nevertheless, there are some kinds of monument, particularly passage tombs of Maeshowe type, that are only found in Orkney. It would be possible to fill this entire lecture with speculation about typochronological sequencing, but I realise that not everybody would share my passion for this, especially as it smacks of advanced stamp collecting. But it is important to try to get a grip on what kinds of monument were built when, and what are the main trajectories of change, and what drove this change. So, to give you some idea of the challenges involved in doing this, this slide gives you a panorama of radiocarbon dates for human remains from a variety of funerary monuments on Orkney, with the plans of the monuments in question beside them. Dates that obviously relate to later secondary activity have been excluded. Can we say that these dates show us when these monuments were built? Not really, since none actually dates a construction episode. All they indicate is a period of use. and a date by which a monument was in existence, if we assume that they weren't bringing in old bones from elsewhere. Moreover, what complicates matters is that the areas within the red boxes fall within a known plateau in the radiocarbon calibration curve, and so the dates inside these could all belong to a period just about any time between 3350 and 3000 BC. This makes it really difficult to arrive at fine-grained typochronologies, despite all the advances that have taken place in the Bayesian modelling of radiocarbon dates. That said, it can be argued, as I will in a moment, that the Maes-Howe type passage tombs that you see on the right were a relatively late addition to the repertoire of monument forms. My money is on them appearing between 3200 and 3100 BC. It can also be argued that their appearance influenced the design of some other monuments that you can see at the bottom right. The idea of building recessed cells and having passages at right angles to the chambers look to be elements that were borrowed from Maes-Howe type passage tombs and tacked onto more traditional Orcadian monument designs. Furthermore, it is possible to detect some sequences through multi-period monuments such as these in Caithness, and these illustrate one of my main points that I want to make, that of aggrandizement. In these cases, at some time, possibly around 3500 BC, massive long-horned cairns were erected over pre-existing passage tombs with round and, in one case, heel-shaped cairns. And you can see clearly in the silhouette view of Camster Long how the original round cairns can still clearly be made out, poking up above the rectangular cairn. It is perhaps significant that people were choosing to impose a rectangular cairn form, which had previously been associated with monuments relating to users of carinated bowl pottery, onto the circular cairn form that's associated with the Breton Atlantic passage tomb tradition. Could this be a case of cultural appropriation, a kind of rebranding, where a different cultural identity was being imposed on pre-existing monuments? That's what it looks like to me. Given that there are quite a few long-horned cairns in Caithness and Sutherland, might these relate to a process of competitive conspicuous consumption on monuments which were built ostensibly to house and honour the ancestors? It's a case of mine's bigger and better than yours, I think. It wouldn't be the last time that something like that had happened. Just look at the cathedrals of Europe, for example. And here we can see a similar process of aggrandizement in Orkney, where it takes two forms. Here at Point of Cot on Westray, people chose to build a massive long-horned cairn from scratch. It wasn't an addition to a pre-existing monument. And in the upper half of the plan, you can see how they used openwork masonry to help give the impression of a substantial tail to the cairn without having to fill it solidly. At more than 30 metres long, before part of it was lost to the sea, this monument will have been substantially bigger than other candidates for early chamber tombs in Orkney, such as Bigland Round Passage Tomb on Rousey, with a maximum cairn diameter of 12.5 metres. And indeed, its design is more than likely to have been inspired by the long-horned cairns of Caithness and Sutherland. The other variant on the aggrandizement theme in Orkney consisted of building bigger and better versions of stalled cairns. And here you can see an example of a smallish stalled cairn from Ede compared with two examples of massive stalled cairns on Rousey. The one at Mid-Howe is so enormous that it's now sheltered within an aircraft hangar. Of course, this decision to pimp my monument, as it were, could be driven by various reasons, and it wasn't necessarily the case that groups were competing to outdo each other, although my money is on that interpretation. If I am correct in inferring that the prosperous farmers of Orkney were engaged in some kind of inflationary bubble, trying to build bigger and better monuments than their neighbours, then the killer move was that made by the groups who built Maes-Howe and other passage tombs of Maes-Howe type. Essentially, what we see is a set of several passage tombs whose design differs significantly from that of other chamber tombs in Orkney. They have chambers with recessed cells. The one at Maes Howe is cruciform, as you can see here, and they have tall vaulted chambers, long narrow passages and roughly round cairns. They are particularly well built, with the passage of Maes Howe being constructed with enormously long sandstone slabs, the largest estimated to weigh 3 tons. Maes Howe was constructed so the setting sun on midwinter solstice shines along the passage into the chamber. Some other Maes Howe type passage tombs have pecked designs on what are likely to have been lintel stones. This is the most elaborate one from a ruined passage tomb at Pirawall on Westray. These monuments constitute a step change in the sophistication of their design and construction from all other Orcadian chamber tombs. And we can say in all confidence that the source of the inspiration for these spectacular monuments were the even more spectacular passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in the east of Ireland, those at Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth, which were constructed around 3200 BC. Newgrange, with its megalithic art, its cruciform chamber, and its long passage, was built so that the rising sun on midwinter solstice shines, and still shines, amazingly, along the passage and into the chamber, metaphorically bringing to life again the remains of the people buried inside, one of whom, we know from DNA, was the child of an incestuous union. These enormous passage tombs will have been the wonders of the ancient world, and yes, people in Orkney will have heard about them because there had been a network of contacts linking Orkney with the Outer Hebrides and the Outer Hebrides with Ireland. My contention is that certain ambitious, prosperous members of the community in Orkney, the elite, if you like, indulged in what the anthropologist Mary Helms has called cosmological acquisition. And they brought back grand designs, great ideas about monument design and astronomical orientation from the Boyne Valley. The Maes Howe passage tombs do seem to have influenced the design of a few other monuments that were built in Orkney, such as this one at home of Papa Westray South. And here's another example of Hugo Anderson Weimark's 3D photogrammetric models. Here, the traditional long rectangular chamber design has been embellished with a series of recessed cells, and the entrance passage has been built at right angles to the chamber. The chamber tombs at Isbister and Unston share these features too, and at Now of Lero on Rousey, the chamber of a long-horned cairn was converted to make it look more like a Maes Howe type chamber. The dating evidence for these monuments, such as it is consistent with them being built, or, in the case of Lero, modified after Maes Howe type passage tombs had arrived. The pottery found in them differs from the flat-braced grooved ware that's found in Maes Howe passage tombs. And here you can see the famous Unston bowls from the eponymous Unston chamber tomb. While pots do not equal people, nevertheless, the choice of design for both the pots that were placed inside these monuments and for the monuments themselves was very much a conscious decision and an expression of identity by the people responsible. But for now, in the last few minutes of this lecture, let's whiz through what was happening in terms of funerary practices elsewhere in the huge landmass of Scotland in the last half of the 4th millennium. I said before that there are only 1 or 2 monuments that appear to have been built during this period. Although, of course, future discoveries and dating may change this picture. One of these monuments is this small chamber tomb that was excavated by the late George Kozikowski with Martin Wildgoose at Strathglebe on Skye. The human remains are fantastically well preserved in this pocket of limestone, and they've already produced, well, they've produced several dates now of between 3500 and 3100 BC, with DNA evidence showing that they're descended from continental immigrants. The other monument that may well have been constructed at this period is a small one with 2 small rectangular chambers at Gleckna Bay on the island of Bute. A skull fragment has produced a date of around 3300 to 2900. Much has been made in the past by some people about the fact that this monument was constructed on a pre-existing shell midden, with people citing this as proof that the indigenous hunter-fisher farmers were responsible for introducing farming to Scotland. And they talk about the persistence of place. There's just one thing wrong with that hypothesis. When we got a deer bone from that shell midden dated, it turned out that the midden is 1,000 years older than the human remains. So it's not a case of persistence of place by hunter-fisher foragers, but a coincidental choice of a prominent location in the landscape. As for the non-monumental funerary practices elsewhere in Scotland, there's evidence for the continuing use of caves and of the Ancoran rock shelter for burial. And here you see a 1920s photograph of the so-called bone caves at Inchnadamh during their excavation. Elsewhere, there's a woman buried at Ballyvullen on Tiree, whose remains have provided the earliest evidence of rickets in Britain. She was buried in a contracted position as if asleep, probably in a small cemetery of unmounded graves between around 3,300 and 3,000. And at Ballintor, in the old county of Ross and Cromarty, the unburnt remains of an adult man were found in a stone kist, with the remains of an infant having been added subsequently. These have both been dated to between around 3,300 and 3,000, and the sex of the infant has been established as male through DNA analysis. Up in Shetland, there is a kist with the communal remains of 11 adults and 9 sub-adults. They did it when they were doing work on Sunborough Airport. There was evidence for starvation here, because they were farmers in a very unforgiving environment of Shetland. It was very different. They tried not to eat fish, but when their children were starving, we know from isotopic analysis that they fed their children fish. Some of the kiddies didn't make it and died. Others did make it through, and then they stopped eating fish. Absolutely fantastically interesting story. And also, we know at Nap of Hower on Papa Westray in Orkney, human bone was found, dating to this period, was found in the house here. Elsewhere, there is a possible case of a grave with a high status assemblage of exotica at Greenbrae in Aberdeenshire. This consists of a necklace of so-called monster beads made from jet and amber, along with a fine flint axe head, and all of these have been definitely imported from Yorkshire, because you get Whitby, fantastic jet at Whitby in Yorkshire. Unfortunately, as this was a very old and badly documented find, we can't say for sure whether these artefacts did come from a grave. Date-wise, it could be as early as around 3,600 or 3,500. We're on firmer ground with these two finds of fancy imported Yorkshire flint items. One, a so-called Seamer axe head, found along with a fine knife, both of Yorkshire flint, in a grave dug into a pre-existing early Neolithic long barrow at Bigger Common in South Lanarkshire. And the other, a so-called Duggleby adze, was found in a boulder-built kist with a large capstone at Nappers in Dumbartonshire. Both of these fancy blades, which are very rare in Scotland, can be dated to between 3,350 and 3,200 BC by analogy with the dated Duggleby adze from the eponymous site of Duggleby Howe in Yorkshire. These finds give us tantalising glimpses of social inequality in parts of Middle Neolithic Scotland, as well as strong and long-term links with Yorkshire, God's own country, I have to say. Let's end with a very quick whiz through what we can say about funerary practices in Scotland around 3000 to 2500 BC. As before, they're many and varied. Very few, if any, new funerary monuments seem to have been built at this time, although there was secondary activity at pre-existing monuments, at least in Orkney. In central Scotland, principally at Cairn Papel and Forteviot, we see small cemeteries where cremated human remains were buried in small pits, in a manner reminiscent of English cemeteries such as at Duggleby Howe or Dorchester-on-Thames. That's a practice that probably started just before 3000 BC. Meanwhile, in Tayside and Fife, there's a localised cluster of large timber structures that have been interpreted as exposure platforms for air burial of the dead. Where grooved ware pottery is found in association with human remains on mainland Scotland, the practice seems cremation. And then we'll look at Scarabray in Orkney, where two women were buried under the wall of House 7. Before we'll end by taking a very quick trip up to Callanish. So let's start briefly with those cemeteries of cremated remains. At Cairn Papel, on the top of a hill with commanding views over the landscape, 13 deposits of cremated remains were found, with some of these placed at the foot of an arc of 7 small standing stones, in an area subsequently covered by the large mound that you see here. People must have brought these remains up the hill, as they are unlikely to have lived on the hill. Two of these deposits were associated with long burnt skewer pins of bone or antler that must have been used to fasten a funerary garment. I got one of these pins dated, and you can see here the radiocarbon date, 3350 to 3020. At Forteviot, near Perth, another small cemetery was found with the same kind of burnt skewer pins, and you can see the dates here. And there are a few other sites that have produced small numbers of deposits of cremated bone, or even individual deposits, although without the distinctive pins. These pins are significant because skewer pins have been found in cemeteries in England, including at Duggleby Howe in Yorkshire and at Dorchester upon Thames in Oxfordshire, and even in the Aubrey holes in the Phase 1 monument at Stonehenge. And this hints at widespread commonality of practice in Britain, reaching as far north as central Scotland in the centuries around 3000 BC. In particular, the link with Yorkshire echoes the evidence from those fancy flint axe and adze heads we've just seen. And you can read more about these cemeteries in this recent article by Gordon Noble and Kenny Brophy, and in this book about prehistoric Forteviot. A much more localized phenomenon can be seen in Tayside and Fife, with the construction of large timber enclosures that are believed to have housed raised platforms for the laying out of the dead for exposure in a kind of sky burial. Two of these were found at Balfarg Riding School, each around 20 by 10 metres, and others have been excavated at Little and Carsey Mains. The question of whether these structures were associated with grooved ware pottery that's been found at these sites is something which I can't deal with here. But at Balfarg, it looks as though the grooved ware was a later addition. The drawing on the right shows a possible reconstruction of one of these structures. And here's an alternative and light-hearted reconstruction that didn't make it into, oh, it did make it into the final publication. This is a swimming pool. Grooved ware has been associated with funerary practices on the Scottish mainland, where the rite has been cremation. Alex Gibson's dating work on the cremated remains associated with the small stone circle at Balbirnie in Fife, not far from Balfarg Riding School, has shown that they were buried in the stone sockets around the 31st or 30th century BC. There are only one or two other instances of association between human remains and grooved ware on the Scottish mainland, but the rite is cremation, and you can see the Bayesian models of these dates. And back up in Orkney, there's evidence that two elderly and arthritic women were uniquely buried in a kist under the wall of House 7 at Skara Brae, behind where the bed area was. They had been buried side by side, their legs and arms flexed, and an osteological report by Professor Thomas Bryce of the University of Glasgow showed that they had suffered not only from arthritis, but also from fusion of the vertebrae, which meant that they would have had stiff and painful backs. One of them was 1 metre 56 tall, that's 5 foot 1.5 inches in old money. The other one was 1.58 meters, 5 foot 2.5. Just a shade shorter than I am, folks. The shape of their leg bones revealed that they had habitually squatted on their heels rather than sitting flat. These give us a precious insight to the lives of the inhabitants of Skara Brae. Sadly, the human remains are believed to have been thrown out from a store in Glasgow during the 1960s, but at least some brilliant sleuthing by Alexandra Shepherd has been able to identify the decorated stone that had formed the front slab of the kist. The presence of these two women sealed into the fabric of a house raises all sorts of questions about their position in the community. But rather than making us think of the mother in the Bates Motel in Psycho, or even worse, of mother-in-law jokes, this act of physical integration within the fabric of a house should remind us of the complexity of Neolithic funerary practices and how the dead were never far away from people's thoughts. Finally, there is remarkable evidence from Callanish, from that fantastic site there, that around 2450 BC, people built a tiny chamber tomb which harked back to the chamber tombs that had been built 1,000 years before in the Outer Hebrides. And this chamber tomb was placed inside the pre-existing Phase 1 monument, which was this ring of stones. And at the same time, they added these rows and this avenue here, and they reorientated the site from a predominantly solar orientation to a lunar orientation. And and the kind of pottery that was associated was international beaker pottery. We know that people were coming from about 2500 BC from the continent to different parts of Britain and Ireland. So on the island of Col, a young woman from Sorrisdale, we know, had come from Germany. But why, it's this fascinating combination of giving a retro style, building a retro style monument, which cemented the ancestry of these people, or the claimed ancestry, with the people who'd always lived there. But also they were hip. They were using this fancy, prestigious, modern continental style of pottery. And what a cheeky thing to do. They were appropriating an ancient sacred monument for the burial of somebody very important. And unfortunately, when they stripped the peat in 1858, they said, oh, there were sort of spongy bits of bone, but we didn't keep them. What a shame. But by aligning it on the moon at its 18.6 years major southern standstill position, it meant that the setting moon would shine in lightening up the central circle and shining into this tomb, or shining on top of the tomb, thereby bringing to light again the spirit of this illustrious person. I've just come back from Cannonish, where I spent many hours deep into the night failing to see the moon at its major southern standstill because it was cloudy. And we don't know how many times in prehistory it was also cloudy, but apparently Basho, the 17th century Japanese poet, wrote a haiku about how he had walked the full length of Japan to go and witness the moon doing the same thing, only to arrive and find it was cloudy and raining. So his little haiku poem is all about the pleasure of not seeing the moon. Anyway, there you go. What about the future? The future is bright and it's very exciting. So, thanks to wonderful generosity of the late Audrey Henschel, she left a big amount of money to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and her Audrey Legacy Henschel Legacy Fund, half of it has been dedicated to a project run by Archaeology Scotland under the Boyne to Brodgar research umbrella to look at, investigate and excavate three of the earliest megalithic monuments in Scotland, and to create a wonderful GIS database that gives you all the information you ever want to know about these monuments, not just in Scotland, but wherever they are found in Britain and Ireland. So watch this space, folks. And thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry I've gone on an awful long time, but I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was amazing. I think you've stunned people into into silence because we don't have really any questions in our Q&A session. But I think probably given that it's nearly 6:15, we can probably forgo any questions today. But I just want to say thank you very much for giving up your time to give this talk this afternoon. And thank you also to everybody who joined. This has been a really great event, and hopefully you've really enjoyed hearing about all this information. I know some of you joined a bit later, so this session is recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel next week. So if you want to delve deeper into some of the things that Alison has talked about today, you can go back and watch it. And if you've got any questions at all for me about Scottish Archaeology Month or anything that has been covered today, please do just get in touch. Okay, so I'll end the session now and just say thank you very much for coming. Okay.